Widowed Lumberjack found three freezing and unconscious Apache women lying in the forest. But Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Elias Boone's days had all looked the same since his wife passed 2 winters ago. He woke in silence, cooked oats over the stove, sharpened his axe, and walked into the timberline until his arms and shoulders ached. The work filled the hours. The cabin was far enough from town that no one bothered him, and that suited him. He was not a man who liked talk. Woodcutting was his trade, and solitude had become his way of surviving. That afternoon he had been higher up the ridge than usual, cutting spruce that had split in last month's storm. He loaded what he could carry, straight lengths for the stove, knots for kindling, into his crate, strapped it across his back, and started the slow walk home. His only mission, same as always, was to get through winter with enough fuel to last. The trail narrowed where the pines gave way to open stone. Elias followed the sound of the creek, steady water moving shallow over rock. That was when he saw them. At first he thought it was clothing caught in the brush, rags thrown by travelers. But as he stepped closer, he froze. 3 women lay on the gravel bar by the creek. Their dresses were torn, their skin bruised and pale under the cold. Their hair was matted, strands sticking to their cheeks. None of them moved. He dropped his load of wood. His first thought was that they were already gone. His chest tightened. He had seen death before, on battlefields and in his own house when sickness had taken his wife, but the sight still made the back of his neck prickle. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers to the neck of the nearest. Faint, but there. He shifted to the second. The same. The smallest. A young woman with a narrow face, shallow breath that rattled through parted lips. They were alive, but barely. Elias sat back on his heels, heart beating heavy in his ears. He looked at the trail. Town was 5 miles west. He could fetch help, but by the time he got there and back, these women would be dead. His hands tightened into fists as he thought it through. He had a choice: leave them to fate or shoulder the weight himself. He muttered, "Damn it," under his breath. His body was already sore from a day's work, and the climb back to his cabin would break most men without a burden. But leaving them wasn't an option. He remembered his wife, pale and fading on their bed, her hand cold in his. He had sworn then that if he could ever stop someone else from being left alone in that way, he would. He shrugged off his coat and spread it under the smallest woman. He slipped his arms beneath the first, bronze-skinned, long black hair falling loose, and hoisted her across his right shoulder. The dead weight pressed into his collarbone. His knees shook, but he gritted his teeth and bent for the second, dragging her limp body across his left shoulder. His breath came rough now, chest straining under the twin loads. For the third, he pulled his wood crate into the gravel, laid rags inside, and lowered her into it as gently as his trembling arms would allow. He cinched the straps tight and lifted the crate against his back. When he stood, all 3 were on him, dragging him down. His legs quivered, every joint burning. His mind screamed at him to stop, to drop them and save himself, but he forced one boot ahead of the other. He told himself, just make the ridge, then the next rise, then the turn past the big pine. Halfway up the first slope, his right foot slid on ice. He went down hard on one knee, the weight of the women crushing his spine forward. For a long second, he thought he wouldn't get up. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. He forced his left hand into the snow, pushed until his legs locked, and staggered upright. He adjusted the strap on the crate. One limp hand had fallen free, pale fingers brushing against his coat. He tucked it back under, tied it with his belt, and carried on. The trail stretched longer than it ever had before. Trees swayed above him, branches cutting the fading light. His lungs burned, shirt damp with sweat that froze against his back. By the time the clearing came into view, he was stumbling, half blind with exhaustion. His cabin stood plain and square among the pines. He staggered to the door, kicked it open, and let the weight down one by one. One on the bed, another on the bench, the third on the rug by the hearth. He bent over, palms on his knees, sweat dripping from his beard, breath rough and uneven. Then he straightened, struck a match, and lit the stove. The room began to warm, as he fed kindling and logs into the fire. He stripped the damp shirt from his back, tore it into strips for bandages, and set water to boil. He looked at them, three strangers, helpless in his cabin, and felt the same knot in his chest that he had felt by the creek. Fear, yes, but also duty. Elias Boone was a man used to silence, but now the silence carried weight. These women were his responsibility, and he knew, without question, that leaving them behind had never been an option. The stove roared in the corner, logs spitting sap, filling the cabin with a heat that fought back the cold clinging to the three women. Elias Boone moved between them, sleeves rolled, hair damp with sweat from the haul. He checked each face in the firelight, his eyes narrowing as he looked for signs of fever or worse. Their lips were pale, breath shallow, skin bruised, and scraped in ways that raised more questions than he had answers for. Who had done this? How long had they been lying out there in the creek bed? He didn't know, but what he did know was that they wouldn't survive the night without care. He poured water from the boiling pot into a tin bowl, letting the steam rise against his face before tearing one of his old shirts into strips. He dipped the cloth and began to clean the dirt from their arms and foreheads, careful not to push too hard against wounds. The smallest of the three whimpered at the touch, eyes moving under closed lids. That sound made his chest tighten. He had heard it before years ago, when his wife Sarah had been too weak to do more than breathe against the fever. His hand stilled for a moment, jaw tight, then he forced himself on. This time he would not stand back helpless. The women's dresses were torn at the seams, fabric stiff with mud and blood. He noticed it immediately. He was not the kind of man who ignored what was in front of him. His gaze stayed on the damage more than on what was beneath, though more than once he caught himself looking away too quickly. Their modesty mattered, even if they were unconscious, and he draped his spare wool blanket across each body after cleaning them, pinning it under their shoulders to hold it firm. He pulled the shawl that had belonged to Sarah from the chest at the foot of the bed and laid it over the one who seemed strongest, her dark hair spilling across the fabric. When the first woman stirred, her eyelids fluttered and then slowly opened, her eyes fixed on him in the flicker of the fire. He froze where he stood, hand still on the pot handle, and waited. She looked around the room, her gaze sharp even though her body trembled. Then her voice came rough, almost too faint to hear. "Where?" "You're safe," Elias said, voice low and steady. It was the first time he had spoken since he'd carried them in. He poured broth into a tin cup, thickened with beans and a little jerky he had boiled down, and moved slow as he crouched by her side. "Drink." Small sips. Her hand shook when she tried to hold the cup, so he steadied it with his own. She drank, lips touching the edge in small pulls, and after a few swallows she leaned back, eyelids heavy. He studied her face, bronze skin, a cut across the cheek, dirt clinging where he hadn't yet cleaned. Her gaze flicked once to the torn edge of her own dress where the blanket had slipped, then back to his eyes. He adjusted the blanket without a word. She let it stay, saying nothing more. The other two had not woken yet, but their breathing was steadier. Elias sat back on a chair near the stove, boots planted on the floorboards, and watched the rise and fall of three blankets. His mind circled questions that wouldn't leave. Where had they come from? Why were they in the forest, left to freeze? Were there men who would come looking? If so, what kind of men left women in such a state? He rubbed a hand over his beard, uneasy. He had lived far from town, for good reason. He didn't want trouble. But he also knew he could never have walked away. These women were alive because he carried them. That made them his responsibility now, whether he had asked for it or not. When dawn came gray through the window cracks, Elias fed the stove again, then stepped outside for the first time since the night before. The air was sharp, the clearing covered in frost, his breath rising in clouds. He checked the tree line, eyes scanning for tracks, half expecting to see signs of someone watching. Nothing but deer sign near the frozen brush. He split a round of wood just to keep his arms moving, then carried the pieces back inside. The woman who had spoken earlier was awake again. She sat up this time, leaning against the bedpost, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. She studied him as he set the wood down, her expression unreadable, guarded. "What's your name?" Elias asked, breaking the silence. Her lips parted, and after a moment she said, "Tala." Her voice was stronger now. She gestured weakly to the others still lying close by. "Sani, Ren." She coughed and pulled the blanket tighter. "You?" "Elias Boone," he answered. He ladled broth into the pot again, poured another cup, and held it out. "You're safe here. That's all you need to know for now." Tala looked at him a long time before she took the cup. Her fingers brushed his, light but deliberate, testing him. He held steady, said nothing. She drank slow, her eyes never leaving his face. In that silence, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. She understood he had carried them here when most men would have turned away. He understood that her will was intact, even if her body was not. Elias sat back again, the fire warming the room, and for the first time since he found them, he let himself breathe easier. He still didn't know what storm had brought them to his creek bed. But whatever it was, they were here now, under his roof, and he would see them through the night and the day after. He hadn't chosen this, but he knew he wouldn't let go of it either. The cabin smelled of smoke and broth, a mix that clung to the rafters. Elias Boone moved about the room in slow, steady motions, feeding the stove, folding blankets, rinsing rags in warm water. He had spent years living alone, and his hands carried the rhythm of habit, but with 3 women in the room, every action felt weighted. His silence, once a shield, now seemed too heavy, and he caught himself glancing toward them more often than he meant to. Tala had propped herself against the bedpost, her black hair hanging loose around her face. Her blanket was pulled close, but her eyes stayed sharp. She was watching him, not timidly, but as if measuring him, deciding what kind of man he was. Sani and Ren were still weak, though both had stirred during the night. Their breathing was stronger now, no longer rattling in their chests. That fact eased some of Elias's tension, but not all. He brought a tin plate of flatbread, burned around the edges from the pan, and set it on the table. Tala's gaze lingered on it before her eyes lifted back to him. "Why?" she asked, voice rough but clear. Elias paused, hand resting on the chair back. "Why what? Why did you not leave us there?" Her question hung heavy in the air. He could have said many things, because he wasn't raised that way, because he'd made a promise to himself after Sarah died, because walking away would have made him less of a man than he could live with. Instead, he answered simple, "Because you'd have died." Tala studied him, her lips pressing thin. She gave a small nod, as if weighing his words against her own memories. After a pause, she said, "Men before you, when we begged for water, they turned away." One laughed. She looked down then, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Elias felt his jaw clench. He looked away toward the stove, his hand tightening on the chair. The image cut sharp into him. 3 women left to die while others walked by. It was the kind of cruelty he despised most. Cowards who carried no weight but their own. "That's not me," he said, voice flat. Tala's eyes softened, though only slightly. She reached for the bread with trembling hands, tearing off a piece and chewing slow. She swallowed and pointed toward her companions. "They need food too." Elias nodded and crossed the room. He helped lift Ren against the pillow and pressed a cup of broth to her lips. She drank in sips, eyes half-lidded, but color returned faintly to her cheeks. Sani stirred next, a faint groan escaping her throat. Elias steadied her head as she drank, careful not to spill. His hands were large, scarred, but steady, and Tala watched every movement, seeing that he did not push more than they could take. When they had finished, Elias gathered the dishes and set them aside. He felt the questions pressing at him, the same ones anyone would ask if they had been sitting in the cabin that night. Who were these women? Where had they come from? Who had hurt them? He dried his hands on a rag and finally asked, "How long were you out there before I found you?" Tala's eyes flicked to Sani and Rin before returning to him. 2 nights, she said quietly. "We walked until we fell. We had no food, no fire. Why were you out there at all?" Elias asked, tone even but not harsh. She hesitated, her chin lifting as if to guard herself. Then she said, "We were taken, kept by men who traded drink and coin. We escaped when they fought among themselves. We ran until we could not stand. That is what you found. The words settled over the room like stones. Elias exhaled slow, steadying himself. He wasn't shocked by the cruelty. He had seen men do worse. But the thought of them abandoned, freezing by a creek, stirred a low anger in him he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at them again, at their torn clothing, bruises along wrists where ropes might have been. He forced his voice steady. "You won't be taken again. Not while you're here." Tala's eyes lingered on him, testing for falsehood. She found none. She leaned back against the bedpost, fatigue showing in her shoulders. Elias stood, moving to the window, scanning the tree line. He thought of Nate Finn at the trading post, of deputies who asked too many questions. If those men came looking for these women, trouble would follow. He tightened his jaw and turned back. Trouble or not, he had made his choice the moment he bent his knees at the creek bed. The fire popped. Wren shifted under her blanket, whispering Tala's name in half-sleep. Tala reached to steady her, hand gentle on her sister's arm. For a moment, Elias saw something familiar. Family clinging to family, the same way Sarah had clung to him in her final hours. His chest tightened. He looked away, stoking the stove harder than needed. That night, he laid his bedroll on the floorboards near the door. He wasn't planning on sleeping much. His axe leaned against the wall within reach, the fire still alive behind him. He listened to the sound of 3 women breathing under his roof, and in the quiet he accepted what it meant. His life had shifted, whether for a week or for good. He was no longer alone. Morning came with frost thick on the window panes and the pale sound of wind in the pines. Elias Boone woke early, as he always did, his bedroll stiff under him and his axe within reach. For a moment, he forgot the weight of the previous days. Then he heard the soft breathing in the cabin and remembered he was not alone anymore. 3 women lay within arm's reach of his stove, alive because of him, and he carried the knowledge that every choice now mattered. He rose and stoked the fire back to life, careful not to wake them. The questions that had been gnawing at him since the night, he found them pressed harder now that they were gaining strength. Where exactly had they come from? Who were the men that had left them bruised and half dead? Would those men come searching? And if they did, what would he do? His mind worked through each thought as he set oats to boil. He had a rifle by the door, but one man against a group, he knew the odds. Still, the decision had been made. He would not hand these women over to anyone. By the time the cabin filled with the smell of oats and coffee, Tala was awake, her eyes following him quietly. She sat with her blanket wrapped close, hair hanging over her shoulder. She looked stronger today, though pale, and Elias noticed her gaze move around the cabin as if she was only now truly taking in where she was. Her eyes lingered on the axe by the door, then the rifle above the mantel, then on him. "You live here alone?" she asked, her voice stronger than yesterday. "I do," Elias answered, setting bowls on the table. "Been that way near 2 years." Her eyes studied him, searching for more. "Why so far from town?" He paused, his hand tightening around the handle of the pot. He did not talk about Sarah easily, but he could tell from the way Tala asked. She wanted to know who this man was who had carried her from the creek and now fed her under his roof. "My wife died," he said, voice flat but steady. "I stayed. Didn't see a reason to leave." Tala's face softened just a fraction, but she did not press. She understood the kind of silence grief left behind. She glanced at Sonny and Wren, who were stirring awake, and changed the subject. "Will the men who held us come here?" Elias set the pot down, the sound sharp against the table. It was the question he had been asking himself since the moment she told him the truth of their escape. "Maybe," he said honestly, "men like that don't let go easy. But this is my land. If they come, they won't take you." The words were simple, but his tone carried weight, and Tala believed him. She nodded once and pulled the blanket tighter. Later that day, when the women had eaten and rested, Elias stepped outside to split wood. The cold bit deep, his breath clouding the air as he set the axe into rounds. Each swing carried not only the rhythm of labor, but the restless thoughts running through his head. He had supplies enough for 1 man, maybe 2, but not 4. He would need more flour, more beans, more salt. He had avoided the trading post for weeks at a time, but now he would have to go. That meant questions, and he hated questions. He turned at the sound of the door creaking. Tala stood in the doorway, the shawl pulled around her shoulders, watching him. Her face was still tired, but her stance was steadier than yesterday. "You should be resting," he called. "I rested enough," she said, voice calm but firm. She stepped down into the frost, boots too big for her feet, the ones he had given her the night before. She crossed to him slowly, her breath visible in the cold. "We will help." Elias frowned, setting the axe into the block. "Not yet. You need your strength." Her eyes held his, stubborn proud. "If we are to stay alive, we cannot lie down while you work." For a moment, he almost argued. Then he saw the truth in her face. She would not be treated like something helpless. He gave a small nod. "All right, start small. Kindling. Stack it by the door." Tala inclined her head and turned back toward the cabin. Elias watched her go, his chest tight in a way he couldn't name. He admired her will, even after all she had endured. And with that admiration came something else, worry, because will alone wouldn't protect them if men came knocking. As if the thought summoned it, a sound broke through the clearing later that afternoon. Hooves, a rider coming slow down the trail. Elias's hands went instinctively to the axe still in the block, then to the rifle leaning by the door. His stomach tightened. He had known it was only a matter of time before someone came. The rider pulled up at the edge of the clearing, Nate Finn, the trader. A man Elias had known for years, talkative by nature, always carrying news. Nate tipped his hat, eyes squinting against the cold. "Been a while, Boone," he called, voice carrying across the frost. "Figured you'd be needing lamp oil, nails, maybe flour. Folks in town wonder if you're still breathing." His eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the faint smoke from the chimney. "Heard talk of strangers in these woods, too." Elias kept his expression even. "I've got use for nails," he said, stepping forward, body angled to block the view toward the door. "And oil. Bring what you've got." Nate nodded, but his eyes narrowed, curiosity sharpening. "You sure nothing unusual up here?" Folks swear they saw a sign. Tracks might be runaways. Or trouble. Behind Elias, the cabin door creaked faintly. He knew Tala was inside listening. He squared his shoulders and spoke calm but firm. "Only tracks you'll find are mine. Snow holds a lot of lies this time of year." Nate studied him a long moment, then shrugged. "Maybe so. Still, if you hear anything, you tell me. Men in town don't like trouble creeping this far north." "I'll handle what comes," Elias said, voice flat, and handed over coin for the goods. Nate gave a long look, then turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Elias stood in the clearing long after the rider disappeared. His grip was tight on the nails and oil jaws set hard. Trouble wasn't far. He knew it, and he knew the women inside the cabin were at the center of it. When he stepped back into the warmth, Tala's eyes were on him. She had heard enough to understand. He set the goods down on the table and looked at her squarely. "They'll come asking again," he said. She didn't look away. "Then we stay ready." For the first time, Elias saw not just a burden in his cabin, but a partner standing in front of him, unbroken in spirit despite everything. And that realization brought him both a measure of strength and a deeper fear for what lay ahead. The day after Nate Finn's visit broke clear and sharp. The snow crusted hard enough to carry weight without sinking. Elias Boone rose before dawn as always, his body wound to the rhythm of habit, but now his every move was matched with a thought. The women in his cabin weren't ghosts passing through. They were staying, and that meant change. He pulled on his boots, stoked the stove, and checked the rifle before stepping out into the clearing. The air was brittle, sky washed in pale blue. For a moment he stood still, scanning the tree line for tracks Nate might have spoken true about. He saw only deer sign and the deep marks from Nate's horse leading back down the trail. No strangers yet. Inside, Tala was already awake, seated near the stove, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She met his eyes when he stepped back in, not looking away. Sonny and Wren still slept, breathing easier than they had the first nights, their faces less hollow. Elias set down the rifle and poured water into the pot. He glanced toward Tala. "You sleep at all?" "Enough," she answered, her tone carrying the quiet defiance of someone who refused to show weakness. She paused, then added, "We heard you speak with that man yesterday. He will bring others." "Maybe," Elias admitted, stirring the pot. "Men like Nate can't keep talk in their pocket. Word gets around. If those who took you are looking, they'll hear it." Her lips pressed tight. "Then we cannot stay hidden forever." Elias didn't answer. He knew she was right. But for now, survival came first. He served her a bowl of oats, plain but hot, and when she reached for it, her fingers brushed his. She didn't pull away. She studied him a moment longer than before, then ate in silence. Later that morning, when the sun rose higher, Elias set to work outside. Tala came to the doorway, insisting again that she and her sisters should help. He started to argue, but stopped when he saw her steady stance in the boots that were too large, her chin set. She wasn't asking permission. She was declaring herself capable. He handed her a small hatchet. "Kindling," he said. "Nothing more." She nodded once and set to it. Her swings were uneven at first, but she kept at it until the pile grew. Elias watched from the corner of his eye as he split heavier rounds, his axe biting deep. There was pride in the way she straightened after each strike, and though her arms trembled with effort, she refused to stop. He recognized the look. Sarah had worn it too when she was determined to prove herself. The memory pulled at him, but he forced himself back into the present. These are not ghosts. They were flesh and blood who depended on him now. Sonny came out next, slower, with Wren close behind, both still weak but insistent. They gathered the split wood, stacking it by the door, laughing softly at each other when their arms shook from the weight. Elias felt the knot in his chest loosen at the sound. Laughter in his yard, something he hadn't heard in years. He didn't show it on his face, but inside, it cut through the silence that had ruled him too long. By midday, the cabin felt less like a shelter for the dying and more like a place where life was returning. They worked together, Tala cleaning the pot, Sonny kneading what little dough they could make, Wren mending one of his old shirts with thread pulled from a ragged hem. Elias found himself pausing at the sight. 3 women moving with quiet purpose under his roof, changing the rhythm of his days without asking leave. Still, questions lingered, and he knew others would be asking them too. Over the meal, he finally spoke. "Tell me their names again. I don't want to mistake them." Tala's eyes softened slightly at the request. "Sonny," she said, nodding to the one at the table, and Wren. Wren gave a faint smile, her hands busy with the shirt. "We are sisters." Elias's brow furrowed. "Sisters? All 3? "Yes," Tala confirmed. "Our village was raided last season. Some men took what they wanted. Others were sold. We were moved from camp to camp. Until we ran." The words were plain, but the truth in them carried weight. Elias lowered his eyes to his bowl. He had known cruelty like that existed, but hearing it spoken in his cabin made the air heavy. He looked back up, meeting Tala's gaze. "Then you're not going back. Not while you're under this roof." Tala didn't answer immediately. She searched his face, and when she saw he meant it, she gave a small nod. That night, after the chores were done and the fire burned low, Elias sat in his chair by the stove. The 3 sisters lay wrapped in blankets, their breaths even. Tala was closest to the fire, her face lit by the glow. For the first time, she didn't turn away when she noticed him watching. She held his gaze a long moment, then closed her eyes, trusting sleep to come. Elias sat in silence, his rifle within reach, axe by the door. He knew trouble would find him sooner or later. But for now, in that cabin, he felt something he hadn't in years, a house that was no longer empty. And though he didn't speak it aloud, the thought steadied him. Whatever came, he wouldn't face it alone. The storm rolled in heavy before dawn, snow driving hard against the chinking of the cabin walls, the wind whistling thin through gaps Elias Boone had never quite managed to seal. He woke to the sound of it and lay still for a moment, listening, measuring the weight of the storm in his head. A man living alone might have let the fire burn low and stayed in his blankets. But not now. Not with 3 women under his roof, their survival tied to the heat and food he kept ready. He rose and stoked the fire back to life, stirring the embers until the stove snapped and roared. Tala shifted on the bed, blinking awake. She had been growing stronger every day, and it showed in the way she moved now. Less like someone clinging to survival, more like someone ready to stand on her own legs. She sat up, wrapped in a shawl, and watched him quietly. "You don't sleep much," she said. "Storms don't let me," Elias answered, his voice steady. He set a pot of beans to soak and poured water for coffee. After a pause, he added, "And I keep watch." Her brow furrowed. "For them? The men?" "For anything," Elias said, not meeting her eyes. He had seen enough winters to know a storm could be just as dangerous as any outlaw. But it wasn't a lie either. He had listened most nights for the sound of hooves or boots in the clearing. By mid-morning, the storm was full, snow blinding outside the small windows. The cabin shook with the force of it. Elias showed the women how to bank the fire so the wood lasted longer, how to keep water warming so it wouldn't freeze in the pail. Tala stood close beside him as he worked, her shoulder brushing his arm once. Neither moved away. Sonny and Rin, still weaker, managed what they could, rolling bandages, mending shirts, keeping the floor swept. There were details left unspoken that now pressed for answers. The night before, Elias had asked if they were sisters. They had said yes. But the way Tala's hand lingered on Rin's arm, and how Sonny often deferred to Tala before answering, made him wonder more. So while the storm raged, he asked, "Who was it came after you?" His tone was level, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Tala's gaze dropped for a moment to the floor, then lifted again. Her eyes were dark, steady. They were men who traded flesh for coin. Drifters, gamblers, not all from one place. They took us from our village and passed us from one hand to another. We escaped when their greed turned them against each other. Elias let her words settle. It explained the bruises, the torn clothing, the haunted look that sometimes passed across their faces. He felt the heat of anger rise in his chest. He stirred the pot harder than needed, forcing the feeling down. "If they come here," he said quietly, "they'll regret it." Tala watched him, her expression unreadable. After a long silence, she nodded. The storm pressed on through the day, and the cabin grew closer with every hour. When Elias went to check the door, the wind tried to wrench it from his grip. He slammed it shut again and dropped the bar across it. He turned back to find Tala standing only a few feet away, hair falling loose from her braid. For the first time, her eyes weren't just guarded. They held something else, a flicker of trust, maybe even curiosity. "You could have left us," she said, her voice low but clear over the howl of the storm. "I couldn't," Elias answered. He spoke without thinking, and when the words left his mouth, he realized they were true in a way deeper than duty. The silence that followed was not heavy, not the kind that pressed. It was steady, almost warm, broken only by the fire and the wind outside. As night fell, the storm showed no sign of letting up. The temperature dropped sharp, and the cabin walls creaked under the weight of snow. Elias laid his bedroll closer to the stove, and when Tala moved hers beside his without a word, he didn't stop her. She lay down with her back to him at first, the shawl wrapped tight. But as the cold seeped through the floorboards, she shifted closer until his arm rested around her waist. He kept his touch careful, not taking more than she gave. She leaned back into him, letting his warmth steady her. For the first time since Sarah's death, Elias felt the hollow space in his chest ease. On the other side of the cabin, Sonny and Rin slept close together, their breaths even. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin there was heat, there was presence, there was the beginning of something that felt like a family. Elias stayed awake longer than the rest, listening, thinking. He knew the storm would pass, but the real trouble was still ahead. Men like the ones Tala described didn't just vanish. Sooner or later, they would come looking. He tightened his arm slightly around Tala, his eyes on the fire. If they came, they would find him ready. When the storm finally broke, the forest lay buried under a new weight of snow, the world outside the cabin quiet and white, almost too still. Elias Boone stepped out into the clearing that morning, his boots sinking deep, breath sharp in his lungs. He scanned the tree line the way he always did, but this time something caught his eye. Tracks. Not deer, not elk. Hoofprints. 2 horses had passed close to his clearing, circling wide, then cutting back toward the ridge. He knelt to study them, his jaw tightening. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to hunt. They were looking. Back inside, the stove gave off steady heat. Tala and her sisters were awake, moving with more strength than the days before. Sani sat mending the strap of a coat with careful stitches, while Rin helped grind beans with the small stone mill Elias had kept since his wife's time. Tala stood by the table, folding one of Elias's shirts she had scrubbed clean in the washpot. The cabin no longer looked like a sick room. It was beginning to look lived in again. Elias leaned his rifle against the doorframe and brushed snow from his coat. "There were riders," he said. His voice was calm, but the weight in it drew all three women's eyes at once. Tala straightened. "Did they see you?" "Not likely. They kept their distance," Elias said. "But they were searching. You told me the men who held you traded drink and coin. If they're missing 3 women, they'll want you back." The silence stretched, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then Tala spoke, her voice steadier than before. "We will not go back." Elias looked at her directly, holding her gaze. "You won't. Not while I'm standing." Her eyes softened, just enough for him to see the gratitude beneath her guarded expression. The day passed in work. Elias cut paths through the snow with his shovel, hauling wood closer to the cabin so no one would have to walk far at night. Tala helped, carrying smaller logs in her arms despite his warning that she should take it easy. He didn't stop her. He had already learned she refused to be idle. Sani and Rin kept the chores inside, setting order to the shelves, mending what little clothing they had. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter against death and more like a place that might be lived in. That evening, as the women sat near the fire, Elias sat in his chair, sharpening his knife. The sound of stone against steel filled the silence until Tala finally broke it. "Your wife." She hesitated, then asked, "What was her name?" Elias's hand stilled. He looked at the blade, then set it down slowly. No one had asked him that in 2 years. "Sarah," he said. His voice came quiet, rough at the edges. "She took sick. Nothing to be done." Tala nodded once. "She was the reason you stayed here alone." "She was," Elias admitted. He let out a slow breath. "But she isn't the reason I carried you from that creek." The words surprised even him. Tala's eyes held his, and in them he saw something shift, her walls lowering just slightly. Later, when Sani and Rin were asleep, Tala sat near him at the table. The lantern threw a soft glow across her face, highlighting the bruises that were fading now. She leaned her elbows on the wood, her blanket slipping from one shoulder. "If those men come back," she said, "they will bring more than 2 horses." "I know," Elias said. He kept his tone steady, though the thought turned his stomach. He wasn't fool enough to think he could take on a gang alone, but he also wasn't fool enough to hand them over. "If they come, we'll be ready." Tala studied him a long moment, then asked the question he hadn't expected. "Why do you care what happens to us?" Elias met her eyes, no hesitation. "Because no one cared what happened to Sarah, and I swore I wouldn't be that man again." She didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. The touch was light, but it lingered. For a man who had lived in silence, it was louder than words. That night, he laid his bedroll, as he always did near the door, rifle within reach. But Tala pulled her blanket closer and, without a word, settled down near him instead of across the cabin. Their shoulders almost touched, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. As the fire dimmed to embers, Elias listened to the snow sliding from the roof, the deep quiet of the forest, and the steady breathing of the women under his roof. The questions were far from answered. Who exactly the riders were, how many, how soon they would return. But for the first time, he felt certain of one thing. He was no longer just surviving the winter. He was standing guard over something worth keeping. The following morning brought a break in the sky, a pale strip of sunlight cutting across the snow-covered clearing. Elias Boone stepped outside with his rifle slung low, scanning the edges of the pines the way a man checks his fences, steady, deliberate, unwilling to trust silence. The tracks he had found yesterday weighed on him. 2 riders circling his land meant eyes were watching. He stooped to study the ground again. Overnight snow had softened the prints, but not erased them. Whoever they were, they weren't far. Inside the cabin, Tala stirred the pot of beans over the stove. She had taken to working alongside him in small ways, her movements slower than his but purposeful. Sonny and Rin sat by the table, folding what little clothing they had, stitching what needed it. The three sisters spoke little in his presence, but he caught them whispering to one another when they thought he wasn't listening. He didn't mind. He figured they were deciding how much to tell him, how much to keep back. He understood the instinct. When he came back in, rifle in hand, Tala looked at him directly. "Tracks again." "Covered some," Elias answered, setting the rifle against the wall. "But I don't like how close they came. Men who wander this far up in winter usually have reason." Her expression tightened. She glanced at Sonny and Rin, then back to him. "They will come to the door sooner or later." "They might," Elias said. His tone carried no panic, only fact. He added, "If they do, I'll speak. You'll stay back." Tala bristled, her jaw tightening. "We are not children. We can stand." Elias met her eyes, his own steady. "You stood long enough. If they see you, they'll try to drag you back." "That's not happening." The words landed heavy, silencing the room. After a long pause, Tala gave the smallest nod. She wasn't agreeing to weakness. She was conceding to trust. By midday, snow had softened enough for Elias to cut a path toward the woodpile. Tala insisted on helping, carrying smaller loads in her arms. When she slipped on the icy patch near the door, Elias caught her by the elbow, holding her steady. She looked up at him, their faces close in the sharp air, and for a moment neither moved. Her blanket had slipped at the shoulder, and his hand tightened around her arm before he let go. She straightened, adjusted the shawl, and without a word picked up another piece of wood. He felt the heat in his chest long after. As dusk approached, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Not far, not circling this time, but coming straight down the trail. Elias's body stiffened. He reached for the rifle and checked the chamber with practiced ease. Tala froze where she stood, then drew her sisters close toward the far side of the cabin. A knock came at the door. Hard, deliberate. Elias stepped forward, rifle angled low, but ready. He opened the door, just wide enough to see two men sitting their horses in the clearing. Both were strangers to him. One wore a patched cavalry coat, the other a wide hat pulled low. Their faces were rough, unshaven, eyes scanning the cabin behind him. "You seen 3 Apache women pass through here?" the man in the cavalry coat asked. His tone carried the sharpness of someone used to being obeyed. "They went missing a week back. Belonged to us." Elias's grip on the rifle tightened. He stepped into the doorway, his frame filling it. "Ain't seen anyone pass this way." His voice was steady, cold. The man narrowed his eyes, studying him. "Strange. Their tracks led this direction. You sure you ain't hiding them?" Elias met his stare without blinking. "I live alone. Always have. Snow covers a lot of mistakes in these woods." "You're chasing shadows." Behind him, he heard the faint creak of the floorboards as Tala shifted, but she made no sound. He prayed she would stay back. The second man leaned forward in his saddle, spitting into the snow. "We'll ride through again. If we find you lied." He let the sentence hang. Elias's voice dropped lower. "You won't." For a long moment, no one moved. The horses pawed at the snow, breath steaming. Then the men turned, pulling their mounts back toward the ridge. Elias didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves faded into the trees. He shut the door and set the bar across it, his breath hard, jaw tight. When he turned, Tala was watching him, her eyes sharp but filled with something new, relief, and something deeper she didn't try to hide. "You risked your life," she said. Elias set the rifle against the wall. "No," he corrected. "I did what had to be done." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was steady, charged with the knowledge that danger had drawn closer, but so had the bond between them. That night, as the fire burned low, Tala sat beside him, not across. Their shoulders touched, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever storm came next, they would face it together. The two riders did not return the next morning, but Elias Boone knew better than to believe they were gone for good. Men like that didn't give up. They would come back with more, and when they did, he needed to be ready. He rose early, checked the rifle twice, and stacked extra wood inside the cabin so the women wouldn't need to step out. His movements were sharp, deliberate, carrying the weight of decision. Inside, Tala watched him. Her sister stayed close to the fire, but Tala stood near the table, her shawl draped across her shoulders. She said nothing at first, only studied the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked to the window every time the wind shifted. Finally, she asked, "How many men can you stand against?" Elias looked at her evenly. "As many as I have to." She shook her head, not out of doubt, but out of the same stubbornness he carried. "We should not make you fight alone. We are not helpless." He paused, weighing his words. "I know you're not, but if it comes to it, I'll take the fight at the door. You keep your sister safe inside. That's how we stand." The day stretched long, every sound outside carrying tension. Near dusk, the sound came again, hooves. Not two this time. More. Elias's stomach knotted as he reached for his rifle. He motioned Tala and her sisters back toward the far wall. "Stay down. Don't move unless I tell you." The knock came heavy, rattling the wood. Elias opened the door just enough to step into the frame. 4 men sat their horses in the clearing, rifles slung across their shoulders. He recognized the one in the cavalry coat from before. "You lied to us," the man called, his voice sharp against the cold air. "Tracks lead right to your door. Hand them over and you walk away breathing." Elias leveled the rifle at the man's chest. His voice was calm, unshaken. "No one here belongs to you. You ride on, or you won't ride at all." The man sneered. 1 man against 4? Elias's finger rested steady on the trigger. "Try me." For a moment, no one moved. The standoff stretched, the horses pawing at the snow. Behind him, he heard Tala's quiet breath, steady but close. He knew she was watching, trusting him with every heartbeat. The man in the cavalry coat finally spat into the snow. "Not worth it. Women don't fetch much half-dead anyway. But you've made yourself a mark, Boone. Men in town will hear about this." He tugged his reins, turning his horse. The others followed, grumbling, but none tested him. Within moments, the sound of hooves faded into the trees. Elias didn't lower the rifle until the forest swallowed them whole. Only then did he close the door and set the bar across it, his chest rising and falling hard. When he turned, Tala stood there, her sisters behind her. She crossed the room in 3 steps and put her hand against his chest, steadying him, though he wasn't swaying. "They'll come again," she said quietly. "Maybe," Elias answered, covering her hand with his own, "but they won't take you. Not from me." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "We choose to stay. All of us." She glanced at her sisters, who both nodded, then back at him. "This is our home now. If danger comes, we face it here." The words settled into the cabin like something final. Elias felt the weight in his chest shift. Not just duty, not just burden, belonging. He had carried them from the creek bed because he couldn't walk away. Now, they were choosing to stay because they wouldn't walk away from him. That night, the cabin was warmer than it had ever been. Sonny and Wren laughed quietly as they prepared a simple meal, and Tala sat beside Elias at the table, closer than before. When the bowls were set down, there was no empty space at the end of the table anymore. Every place was filled. Later, as the fire burned low and the snow pressed against the cabin walls, Elias sat with Tala at his side, her hand resting in his. For the first time since Sarah's death, he didn't feel the hollow silence of the forest pressing in. He felt a household, fragile, maybe, but real. The danger might return one day. Men might come again. But for now, the cabin stood strong, the stove burned steady, and the choice had been made. They were a family, and Elias knew he would give everything he had to keep it that way. And for the first time in years, as the fire dimmed, he allowed himself to close his eyes and rest. Not as a man alone, but as a man with a home once more.